Bill Gates is one of the most hated people of all time. There are just countless articles, forum posts, and memes hating on Bill Gates. Why? I mean, on the surface, Bill should be liked. He's always on the news appearing to support the masses. He's revolutionized computing. He's at the forefront of climate change activism, while also preparing to give all of his money away to charity. However, doesn't this seem just a little too perfect? Well, that's probably because Bill has spent hundreds of millions, if not billions, on creating his perfect image. He's always on the news and social media, propped up as the wise expert voice on the world. But in your own life, can you name a single Bill Gates fan? In fact, do you know anyone who likes this man at all? I mean, back in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, Bill was genuinely liked. He was the Elon Musk of the 90s. However, somewhere, somehow, this all changed, and the cracks in his image are now starting to show. Because the more you start to follow the money of Bill Gates, do you start to understand why he's one of the most hated men alive. Whether it be for the fact that a billionaire alone has the World Health Organization under his personal control, or if it's the fact that he's the biggest landowner in the US, or his very suspicious close connections to Mr. J.E., with J.E. giving Bill Gates marital advice, and Melinda Gates becoming disgusted by Bill Gates' behavior. Not to mention all the countless other reasons, because trust me, this is only scratching the surface. So then who is the real Bill Gates, and how did he become so hated? What was it that changed his public perception? Well, to understand why people are turning on Bill Gates, we need to start with how he even gained his vast power in the first place. William Henry Gates III, better known as Bill Gates, was born in Seattle on October 28, 1955. Being the middle child of an unbelievably powerful family meant success was always expected from Bill, which is why to understand how Bill Gates got to where he is today, we need to understand his family tree first, as arguably it was Bill Gates' family that created the Bill Gates we know today. Bill's grandfather, James Willard Maxwell, was an extremely influential banker. He had served as president of Seattle's National City Bank and was a director of San Francisco's Federal Reserve District No. 12 back in the early 1900s. Similarly, Bill's parents also held significant positions of power. His mother, Mary Maxwell Gates, was heavily involved in an international charity network called United Way. This organization's honestly in a league of its own. Being founded way back in 1887, United Way is the largest non-profit fundraising conglomerate in the world. In an interview, Bill actually described his mother's role in the company as being part of the group that, quotes, decides how to allocate money and looked at all the different charities. Essentially, she was working in a bureau that shows which charities are going to get funded and how much money each of them will receive. Bill's father, William Gates Sr., was also extremely powerful, undoubtedly even more so than his wife, with him being an acclaimed philanthropist among the likes of George Soros and the Rockefellers. Yet, despite his family's lineage, Bill Gates was a small kid who was often picked on by his classmates. However, what Bill lacked in brawn, he made up for in brains, easily excelling everyone in his school. And whilst Bill's parents envisioned a law career in Bill's future, Bill was instead drawn to the new and growing field of computers. You see, back in the late 60s, early 70s, computers were big, bulky, and just too expensive for regular people. The only way they could be feasibly accessed was by renting time on a public computer, and even that was still too costly for most people. But because of his wealthy background, Bill was able to gain access to computers at the young age of 13, where he developed a fascination that would lead him to eventually become the face of Microsoft. In 1968, Bill would write his first software program, a version of tic-tac-toe, and after doing this, Bill was hooked, and his talent for programming didn't go unnoticed, with his school paying him to gain further access to computers. In return for this favor, Bill then wrote a program to completely computerize the school's payroll system. But after money from the school dried up, Bill and his friends bought themselves time on a different computer, owned by the Computer Center Corporation. However, this wouldn't last very long, as Bill and his friend were soon banned after they discovered that Bill had been exploiting a bug in the computer's operating system that gave them extra free time. This was an early sign that Bill wasn't hesitant to break the rules, and Bill was in fact actually rewarded for this. The company that he'd been nicking time from would actually hire him a few months later to find other bugs and exploits in their software. Bill, along with his childhood friend and new business partner Paul Allen, soon went on to form their first company, Traf-O-Data, which specialized in developing software for analyzing internet traffic. Seeing as it was their first company, the business wasn't really a huge success, but it was key in paving the way forward for Bill and Paul's subsequent company, Microsoft. In the meantime, Bill continued to excel academically, after scoring 1,590 out of 1,600 on his SAT score, allowing Bill to begin his enrollment at Harvard. However, he soon realized that Harvard wasn't the place for him, as he would go on to subsequently leave in 1975. After just 2 years of studying, he realized that university wasn't going to further his goals, and instead he would pursue his passion in computers. 1975 would be one of the most important years of Bill Gates' life, because it was around this time that the microcomputer had just been invented, and in 1975, these microcomputers were starting to become kind of widespread. One of the first microcomputers, the Altair 8800, had been released just a year prior. When Bill saw an ad for the computer in a magazine, he instantly saw its future potential. MITS, the company who made this computer, was then contacted by Bill and Paul, who said that they had created a primitive interpretation software, which enabled people to program their own code into the computer, meaning it could function on its own as an operating system. In reality, Bill and Paul hadn't done any of what they said they did, but after MITS got back to them and expressed interest in a demonstration, the door was now open, and after the two worked tirelessly on their project for 2 months, they finally delivered on their promises to MITS. A deal was then struck, and Bill and Paul's software would now go on to be sold with the Altair 8800, and the name that Bill and Paul gave this new business partnership, Microsoft. And then in a span of a few years, Microsoft grew from being a couple of computer geeks in a basement to a fully fledged company. They continued producing various kinds of software, making a name for themselves and further expanding the company in the process. Microsoft had also expanded its scope to create their own programming language based off of their earlier work on the Altair 8800. This was later established as Microsoft Basic and was packaged in a variety of computers. It was clear that Microsoft was now truly on the way up. The company had increased its team and moved offices to Bellevue, Washington. Gates would be heavily involved in all aspects of Microsoft during this time. He both worked in a managerial role, but also took an interest in the code that his company was writing. Gates actually stated that for the first 5 years, he personally reviewed every single line of code that came out of the company. Microsoft was now dipping their toes into the hardware market, releasing products like the Z80 soft card, which let the then popular Apple II run common operating systems that the computer otherwise couldn't. But you see, this was only the beginning. By 1980, Microsoft had scored an even bigger contract. In large part thanks to Bill Gates' family connections, his mum knew the IBM executives and had recommended her son's company. So when IBM's first choice of contractor had issues, Microsoft was happy to step in. This gave them a partnership with IBM to produce an operating system for their new computer. The contract itself wasn't financially huge, but at the time, IBM were giants of the tech industry. The venture brought great prestige to Microsoft, which enabled them to take on bigger and bigger projects as the years went by. The partnership's developed product was later finalized and named MS-DOS, an operating system that would prove to be immensely popular. However, this success brought its own problems. Bill and Paul had been enjoying a fruitful business partnership for years, but with Microsoft's unprecedented rise, the pair now had some bitter disagreements. Their disputes were often based on hiring practices and the products that Microsoft worked on. It's also reported that Gates had become distant around this time, as he was often unreachable and was notorious for not returning phone calls. In 1982, this schism between the two men reached its breaking point when Paul was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. This condition meant that Paul obviously had to take a backseat in the company, which Bill saw as another big opportunity. According to Paul, Bill was, quote, scheming to rip him off and making moves to take further control of the company, a practice that was dubbed mercenary opportunism. Bill says that he remembers this very differently, but it's alleged that the plan was to liquidate Paul's shares in Microsoft, leaving them to Bill and other investors. However, after a few backroom deals, this never came to fruition. Paul still did leave his position as vice chairman, but managed to keep his co-ownership of the company and remain on the board of directors. However, beyond this, there were also numerous allegations that Gates was becoming a tyrant in the company. Witnesses stated that Gates would often berate his employees and their proposals during meetings, forcing them to defend themselves until he was satisfied with their explanation. However, it was Bill's ruthless behavior that marched the company forward, and by 1985, Microsoft would release their first version of what would later become their flagship product, Windows. It was based on their early work on MS-DOS and would soon begin to dominate the computing world. It was hit after hit for Microsoft, and by 1987 they released the Microsoft Office suite of programs. This was also the year that Bill met his future wife Melinda, and from there, Microsoft and Bill Gates would consolidate their positions in technology, healthcare, media, and numerous other aspects of the world, allowing Bill Gates in this period to become one of the world's richest men. At the time, Windows was the main bread and butter of Microsoft's whole business model, but even without it, Microsoft's power was now untouchable, because back in 1986 when the company went public, Microsoft now had the funds to fuel their expansion into everywhere. However, this certainly didn't come without challenges. Most notably, Microsoft faced fierce competition from Apple's operating system. The rivalry between Steve Jobs and Bill Gates was certainly bitter, with Microsoft and Apple being drawn into a legal battle over alleged copyright infringement that went on for years. And yet, as the years went by, by, Microsoft would still continue to dominate the market, with their release of Windows 3.1 being pivotal in propelling Microsoft to becoming the monopoly it is today. At the time, Windows 3.1 was heavily marketed using Microsoft's new resources. In fact, it was actually the first time that Microsoft had ever done a large-scale campaign, and it ended up totaling over $100 million. And yet this would pay off big time, with Windows 3.1 selling over 3 million copies in its first 2 months. This then made Windows the most popular OS in the world, causing Apple to fall behind for years afterwards. Microsoft's dominance was then further compounded by their release of Windows 95, selling 1 million copies in just the first 4 days. In fact, Windows 95 was so popular that it was even adopted by the Chinese government as China's default OS. Using the money from Windows 95, Bill would then pour in the extra money into a new technology on the internet: internet browsers. As the internet was exploding by this point, growing by 2,300%, Microsoft would be quick to release their own version of a browser, and their first one would be Internet Explorer. This would prove to be immensely popular, as it was later packaged with Windows itself. Gates would even broker a deal with his old rival Apple to bundle Internet Explorer with Macs as well as PCs. Because of this, it would go on to be yet another field of tech that Microsoft would dominate in. This was then further combined with tons of other products, many of which held their own monopolies, with Microsoft Office becoming a staple of all businesses and education systems around the world. With all this success, Bill Gates would eventually take a step back from running Microsoft in 1998. Although he was still heavily involved and still owned a large part of the company, Bill Gates would now take a step back to enjoy his billions. I mean, Bill Gates was one of the richest men on the planet. He'd been worth about $2.5 billion by 1990, and then 10 years later, during the dot-com bubble, Bill was reported to be worth $100 billion. But with this growing wealth were growing concerns over Bill Gates' power, with the public starting to question if his wealth had actually been legally gained, because people were catching on to Microsoft's various monopolies over the past few years. And this all came to a head in 1998, when Bill Gates was accused of breaking monopoly rules. He was actually forced to give testimony in front of court. This was then compounded by the burst of the dot-com bubble, causing Microsoft's share prices to go into freefall, leaving the company teetering on the verge of collapse. The dot-com bubble and the monopoly concerns had hit the company so hard that Microsoft's share prices have only just been recovered. It was so bad that it seemed like Microsoft really was going to collapse like many other tech companies at the time. But because of their monopolies and their immense size, the company could weather these challenges. However, what didn't recover was Bill's reputation, and this was a turning point for Bill Gates, because it was after this incident that the tech mogul would do everything he could to change his media coverage. As Gates had the financial resources and influence to do anything he wants, he would influence the public using a much lower profile method. Over the years, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Bill Gates' proxy investment company, would donate about $320 million to various media projects. This included mainstream outlets like CNN and NBC, news publisher associations, as well as foreign and domestic journalist organizations. In fact, Bill Gates' foundation bankrolls so many different aspects of the press that it's possible for Gates to fund entire journalistic careers from their education to the media outlets they work in. Although these donations are publicly listed on the foundation's website, there's no real way to tell how any of these financial grants are actually used by the recipients. Additionally, the foundation only lists financial contributions that were specifically given to media campaigns and outlets. It does not include grants given with the aim of producing articles for specific academia, such as medical journals or other scientific studies, which means Gates' numerous donations that indirectly affect the media are left unlisted. So in simpler words, this means that his grand total spent on news manipulation is likely much more than $320 million. This is part of the reason why up until recently, Bill Gates has had almost exclusively positive coverage in the news, despite his many shady activities, like for example, his foundation effectively privatizing multiple international health organizations. Aside from the US and China, the Gates Foundation is the top financial contributor to the World Health Organization. These contributions allow Gates to have unprecedented influence over public health discussions and decisions. And despite the enormous amount of money that the Gates Foundation has been giving away, Bill's personal net worth has at least doubled since 1990. But Bill won't stop at trying to dominate international health organizations. No, Gates wants to dominate everything. I mean, as of 2021, Bill Gates has become the largest agricultural landowner in America, owning over 269,000 acres. Gates has been silently acquiring farmland in many different states and holding that property in a wide network of shell companies through a subsidiary, Cascade Investment LLC. Mind you, he was doing this during the recession of coronavirus, when everyone was shut up in their houses. When the economy plummeted, Bill Gates then bought up this cheaper land. And the only reason this got discovered was because a research team did some heavy digging on an anonymous Louisiana investor making a $171 million land acquisition. Now obviously Bill Gates didn't want his name anywhere near these purchases, because if people realized the biggest proponent of lockdowns was then using this to profit, Gates would then receive a flurry of negative attention. So Gates has been trying to keep this as quiet as possible. However, once he was exposed, he would quickly go for the narrative that agriculture was merely a good investment. But just imagine for a second the raw power and influence that could possibly come with owning so many acres, becoming the largest landowner in America. By doing this, Gates fully controls what products are grown, how much is produced, how the operations are run, and who works there. And despite having complete jurisdiction over all that farmland, it goes without saying that Gates isn't exactly your typical rancher. The tech oligarch has also co-financed many different kinds of genetically modified food experiments, and is a big purporter of synthetic and artificial meat. Gates believing that we should switch to these alternatives entirely.
What's called artificial meat. And so you have people like Impossible or Beyond Meat, both of which I invested in.
Do you eat it as well, or do you like it?
Absolutely.
You do.
You can go to Burger King and buy the Impossible Burger.
Now, if you're the cynical type, you could say that acquiring all this farmland really has nothing to do with monetary investments or even feeding people, and instead is all about centralizing power over agriculture and imposing specific dietary limitations over the populace. Or you could say this is just a symptom of Gates' megalomania. But however you look at it, these property acquisitions aren't anything new for Gates either, as he has been buying up farmland all over America since at least 2011. This was also the time frame when Gates really started amping up his influence in cultivating increasingly powerful connections. And funnily enough, it was 2011 when Gates would start meeting with a notorious man called Jeb Stein. And unfortunately, I can't say this guy's real name because this is a no-no word for YouTube. But this man and Gates had met dozens of times throughout the early 2010s, usually at JE's property. The official reason Gates gave for his meetings was to discuss global health and other charitable opportunities. Although these meetings occurred well after JE was convicted of soliciting prostitution from minors back in 2008, which is definitely a little bit concerning. Gates' relationship with JE was also part of the reason for him getting divorced, with Bill's wife Melinda hiring divorce attorneys around the same time in 2019 when Gates' connections with JE were made public, with Melinda stating that, quote, "I made it clear to him that I did not like him meeting with JE. It was also alleged that Gates often visited JE for a respite from his marriage, as that was one of the best methods to, quote, get away from Melinda." And Gates hasn't exactly been transparent with his connection with JE either, stating many times that it was simply a mistaken judgment. When asked specifically about JE's background in a PBS interview, Gates responded with,
"There's absolutely nothing new on that."
And the infamous line,
"Well, he's dead, so you always have to be careful."
And with Bill Gates' reputation collapsing, the past few years have also seen Microsoft collapse too. For most of Microsoft's history, there's been very few mistakes, but in the last decade, Microsoft has seen failed project after failed project. Just think of the Windows Phone, for example. And of course, they've had their successes as well, especially in gaming, but their fallback of Windows and other software has stayed exactly the same. They haven't been able to push the frontiers anymore, they're falling behind. However, this is about to change. But before we continue, a quick word from our sponsor, Masterworks. Now, as bad as Bill Gates is, he does have a keen understanding of how to use technology to disrupt industries and make money doing so. Today's sponsor, a unicorn startup, is also at the forefront of innovation, revolutionizing a lucrative yet antiquated market estimated at $1.7 trillion, just as it's predicted to grow another $900 billion in the next 4 years. The contemporary art market has doubled the appreciation of the S&P 500 over the last 25 years, while demonstrating no low correlation to the typical investments of stocks and bonds. But what's even more exciting and relevant is that when the stock market is down and inflation is high, art appreciated by an unprecedented average of 33.2% annually. So it's no surprise 2/3 of millionaires, including Bill Gates, already hedge against inflation with art, according to the UBS. The only problem is, unless you're Bill Gates rich, it's been impossible to access, until now. Masterworks has used technology and finance to disrupt this market, opening it up to investors across the world. Masterworks selects less than 3% of the thousands of paintings they're offered, looking for those with the highest historical appreciation and stability. Then Masterworks acquires the painting and breaks it up into shares for you to invest in. To date, Masterworks has sold 5 paintings with an average net return of 26.8% to investors through 2022's tough markets. And although past performance isn't a guarantee of future results, it's no wonder people have invested over $500 million with them. With no end in sight to inflation, people keep swarming over to Masterworks to help protect their cash. And there is a long wait list to join, but I'm hooking everyone up with priority access to skip the line, and it's as easy as just clicking the link in the description below. Microsoft knows that if they continue at their current rate, they will go bankrupt, and so Microsoft is radically positioning itself to be at the forefront of what tech executives think is the next big thing, the metaverse. We've talked a lot about Facebook's intentions for the metaverse. I mean, obviously Zuckerberg is so invested in it by this point that he changed his company's name, but Meta's metaverse dominance isn't actually inevitable, it's a race. And by recent metrics, it looks like Facebook might actually be losing this race, which on the surface seems great, because as I've mentioned in many other videos, Facebook's new metaverse is horrific, and it poses one of the greatest threats to society as we know it, which is why virtual reality's growth in the business world is actually predicted to outpace gaming and other consumer products. This is how big the metaverse is going to be, and it's not hard to understand why either. There are so many aspects of everyday work that will be easier or just work better in VR, and this also gives companies more and more control of our society, whilst also giving these companies exactly what they crave more of: data. But it's not just data, this is everything: businesses, jobs, culture, society, politics, everything in a metaverse controlled by one or two companies. This is why Walmart, Gucci, McDonald's, Nike are all setting up shop in the metaverse. It may seem outlandish, but it's already happening, and soon you might actually be able to become a wagey flipping burgers in the metaverse working at a virtual McDonald's. And so who are the companies going to control this? Well, it seemed like Facebook was going to be the main company, but there's another company just around the corner that threatens Facebook's entire metaverse monopoly, and that company is Microsoft. And weirdly, it's Microsoft Teams that will be the core of Microsoft's plan for the metaverse. In 2021, Microsoft announced Mesh, which will enable people to have virtual holographic meetings all from the Teams app. And this seemingly simple thing is what's putting Microsoft ahead of other companies. Having their version of the metaverse not tied to any single type of device or operating system is very key. It will make it that much easier for companies to get all of their employees on board. Because everyone already uses Word, the Microsoft Office, and Windows operating system, it will be a smooth transition into the metaverse. And that's why late last year, Bill Gates himself said that within the next few years, the metaverse will host your office meetings. It's a bold prediction, but one that's been made by many other tech companies. And all of this means that it's much more likely we'll see a Microsoft monopoly on the metaverse, or at least for the professional side, because that's the real goal of all these tech conglomerates. The big ones made their names from monopolies, as we've seen through Microsoft's history. And it's the same with all the other companies, Google, Facebook, all virtual monopolies. And so of course the same is true for Microsoft, but instead of trying to monopolize OS software, they want to monopolize the metaverse. If they don't do this, Microsoft is going to collapse. Their crown on the jewel Windows is being eaten up by Apple, Linux, and Chrome OS. And so what Microsoft and Bill Gates are counting on is that the metaverse will put even more power into their hands. The metaverse is their lifeline. The entire company's existence depends on this. It appears that Bill is on a never-ending quest for more, whether it be through money, power, affairs, and control. But no amount of power and influence can continue to convince the public of Bill Gates' likability, because the smell of his true personality is now too overwhelming for the public to ignore. Theodore John Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber, is one of the most interesting people of the 21st century. Both a genius and a madman, Ted engaged in a ruthless campaign of terrorism by mailing bombs throughout the late 70s to mid-90s, all while isolating himself from the rest of society in a small cabin in the woods. For 2 decades, Ted evaded capture, despite being the target of the most expensive FBI investigation in history. But for such an extraordinary life, Ted's early years were relatively ordinary, and at the same time, Ted was creating a revolutionary manifesto. He was using all of his intellect to warn society of the dangerous path that is awaiting us.